Clara Thompson adjusted the strap of her worn leather bag, glancing down at Jonah as they stood in line at the airport check-in counter. At 6 years old, her son was a bundle of energy, shifting from foot to foot and humming softly to himself. His excitement was contagious, even if her own enthusiasm was tempered by an unease she couldn't quite shake. Travel always carried a layer of unpredictability, but for Clara, it often felt like walking a tightrope. She straightened as they reached the counter, offering the attendant a polite smile. "Good morning," she said, handing over their documents. The woman on the other side of the desk looked them over, her gaze lingering on Jonah. "Is he traveling with you?" she asked, her tone neutral but with an edge Clara had learned to recognize. "Yes, he's my son," Clara replied evenly. She resisted the urge to frown as the attendant scanned their tickets, then their passports, and finally the birth certificate Clara always carried just in case. It wasn't the first time she'd been asked to prove that Jonah was hers, though it stung no less each time. The attendant nodded, handing everything back without comment. "You're all set," she said briskly, motioning them forward. Clara murmured a thank you, taking Jonah's hand as they moved toward security. He looked up at her with wide eyes. "Why did she ask so many questions?" he whispered. "She's just doing her job," Clara replied softly, though the explanation felt hollow. She didn't want to burden him with truths he wasn't ready to carry. Truths about the subtle ways the world sometimes saw them as different, as less. At the security checkpoint, the line moved slowly. Clara kept Jonah close, gently reminding him to stay quiet and still as they approached the scanner. She placed their belongings in the bins, her shoes, his small backpack, their jackets before stepping through the metal detector. It beeped, of course. It always did. A TSA agent approached, holding out a wand. "Ma'am, please step to the side," he said. His tone was professional, but the request was familiar enough to feel personal. Clara complied without protest, standing with her arms outstretched as the agent methodically scanned her. Nearby, Jonah waited, clutching his backpack tightly. When it was Jonah's turn, the agent barely glanced at him, waving him through. The contrast was stark, though Clara kept her face neutral. Once they were clear, she knelt to help Jonah put his shoes back on, her hands steady despite the quiet frustration simmering beneath the surface. "Are we almost there?" Jonah asked, his voice tinged with impatience. "Almost," Clara replied, managing a small smile. "Just a little farther, and then we'll be on the plane." By the time they reached the gate, the terminal was bustling with travelers. Clara found an empty seat near the window, settling Jonah next to her with a coloring book. She let out a slow breath, her mind wandering as she watched the planes taxiing outside. Around them, families were laughing, couples whispering, announcements crackling over the intercom. It was an ordinary scene, one she'd been a part of many times before. But ordinary didn't mean equal, Clara thought. Not for everyone. Her gaze drifted to a young white mother nearby, holding a toddler who was squirming in her lap. A flight attendant approached her with a warm smile, offering help with her bags and a bottle of water. The woman accepted gratefully, her tired smile met with understanding. No one had offered Clara help. No one had even looked her way. She pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on Jonah, who was now deeply engrossed in coloring a bright blue airplane. His innocence was her anchor, a reminder of what mattered most. Still, as the minutes ticked by, Clara couldn't help but feel the familiar weight settling on her shoulders, a quiet, persistent reminder that, even here, even now, some journeys were harder than others. The hum of engines reverberated through the cabin as Clara stepped aboard the plane. Jonah's small hand nestled in hers. The air was a mix of recirculated coolness and the faint scent of coffee brewing in the galley. Clara gave a polite nod to the flight attendant at the door, who responded with a quick glance and a mechanical "Welcome aboard." The woman ahead of them, a white passenger with a baby balanced on her hip, received a different greeting. "Oh, what a sweetheart," the attendant cooed, bending down to tickle the infant's chin. She offered the mother an extra blanket and a promise to check on her once they were seated. Clara moved forward without a word, guiding Jonah down the narrow aisle. He looked up at her, his lips curving into the faintest pout. She didn't say hi to me. He murmured. She's probably just busy, Clara replied, her voice even. She didn't want to plant seeds of doubt in him. Not yet. Jonah was still at the age where he believed the world was fair, where kindness was a given rather than a choice. They reached their row and found their seats, two narrow ones near the back of the plane. Jonah scrambled up into his window seat, his face lighting up as he peered outside. I can see the wing, he exclaimed. Clara smiled, her fingers working to stow their carry-ons in the overhead bin. The man across the aisle glanced at them briefly, his eyes flickering with something Clara couldn't quite name before he turned back to his phone. Settling into her seat, Clara adjusted Jonah's seatbelt and handed him a book to keep him occupied. Around them, the cabin buzzed with the sounds of passengers chatting, overhead bins slamming shut, and the occasional laughter from a row ahead. A flight attendant walked down the aisle, helping passengers adjust their bags or answering questions. She stopped several rows in front of Clara to check on an older couple, offering them pillows and an extra bottle of water. Clara waited, watching the attendant draw closer. Jonah was fidgeting now, tugging at the seatbelt that was slightly too tight around his lap. Excuse me, Clara began as the attendant passed, her voice polite but clear. Could we get an extender for his seatbelt, please? The attendant barely paused, her gaze flicking to Clara and then to Jonah. I'll get to it, she said, her tone clipped. Before moving on, Clara let out a slow breath, reminding herself to stay calm. There was no point in making a scene, not over something so small. Still, when she saw the same attendant return minutes later with a snack tray for a family 2 rows ahead, Clara couldn't help but feel the sting of being overlooked. Jonah shifted beside her. Mom, can I get some juice? Not right now, honey, she said softly. We'll wait until they start serving drinks. He nodded, leaning back against the seat. But Clara could see the flicker of disappointment in his eyes, a small crack in his youthful exuberance. It was a look she had seen before, and it always cut deeper than she expected. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Clara stared out the window at the bustling airport below. A luggage cart zipped by, its driver waving to a ground crew member near the tail of the plane. The world outside seemed so straightforward, so orderly, and yet, within the confines of the cabin, there were currents beneath the surface, subtle, unspoken, but undeniable. Clara reached for Jonah's hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. He turned to her with a smile, his earlier disappointment forgotten, at least for now. Are we gonna fly super high? He asked, his eyes wide with excitement. Higher than the clouds, Clara replied, her voice steady. As the plane roared down the runway, Clara closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself for the hours ahead. It wasn't the flight she dreaded, it was the small, insidious ways the world would continue to remind her and Jonah of their place within it. The plane lifted into the sky, carrying them toward their destination. Yet, even as the earth fell away beneath them, Clara felt the weight of something much heavier, something she couldn't leave behind. The plane leveled off smoothly, the faint hum of the engines settling into a rhythm. Jonah pressed his face against the window, marveling at the fluffy white clouds below them. Clara watched him with a faint smile, his wonder a balm to the tension she felt creeping into her shoulders. The flight had been uneventful so far, though Clara noticed the small, familiar details, the way the attendants seemed to pass by her row without a glance, the careful smiles directed at other passengers but never quite at her. It was the kind of thing you could easily miss if you weren't the one living it. Half an hour into the flight, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing mild turbulence ahead. Clara felt Jonah's small hand slide into hers. He looked up at her, his eyes round and uncertain. Is it going to be scary? He asked. No, sweetheart, Clara said, her voice calm. It's just a little bumpiness. Like riding in a car on a bumpy road. We're safe. The plane began to shake gently, the seatbelt sign dinging on above their heads. Clara noticed a few passengers shifting in their seats, gripping their armrests. Jonah clutched her hand tighter, his breaths coming quicker now. It's okay, she said again, leaning close so her voice reached only him. Take a deep breath. Like this. She exaggerated the motion, inhaling and exhaling slowly, and Jonah mimicked her. but his small body still trembled. And Clara glanced toward the aisle, catching sight of a flight attendant a few rows ahead. The woman was checking on passengers. Leaning down to reassure a couple near the front, Clara raised a hand slightly, trying to catch her attention. The attendant didn't look her way. She moved methodically down the aisle, skipping Clara's row entirely. Clara sighed, tightening her grip on Jonah's hand. She didn't want to make a fuss. Didn't want to be that passenger. But the dismissal gnawed at her. Jonah's fear was real, and all she needed was a little help, a kind word. A smile. Something to ease his nerves. The turbulence grew slightly stronger. And Jonah whimpered, burying his face against her arm. Across the aisle, a white man caught Clara's eye. He gave her a small, sympathetic nod before leaning forward to press his call button. The same flight attendant appeared almost immediately. Yes, sir, she asked with a professional smile. Could you check on the little boy over there? He said, nodding toward Clara and Jonah. He seems pretty scared. The attendant hesitated, her smile faltering for a moment. Then she turned toward Clara. Is everything okay here? Clara kept her voice steady, though her frustration bubbled just beneath the surface. My son is a little nervous about the turbulence. If you have a moment, I think it might help if you spoke to him. The attendant blinked, her polite mask slipping slightly. I'm sure he'll be fine, she said briskly. It's just a bit of turbulence. Nothing to worry about. And then she was gone, moving on before Clara could respond. Clara let out a slow breath, forcing herself to remain calm for Jonah's sake. It's okay, buddy, she murmured, smoothing his curls with her free hand. I'm right here. You're safe. Across the aisle, the man who had tried to help offered her an apologetic shrug. Some people, he muttered, shaking his head. Clara managed a small smile in return, grateful for his effort, even if it hadn't changed much. The turbulence eventually subsided, the plane returning to its steady rhythm. Jonah relaxed against her, his breathing evening out, though he still held her hand tightly. Did you see how the clouds were shaking us? He asked after a while, his voice curious now instead of scared. I did, Clara said, her tone gentle. But we stayed strong, didn't we? Jonah nodded, his small face thoughtful, like a boat on the water. He said, exactly like that, Clara replied, as he turned back to the window. Clara's gaze drifted to the aisle, where the flight attendants were beginning drink service. She felt the weight of the small moment settle on her. Not a catastrophe. Not an outrage, just one more piece of a larger puzzle. Sometimes it was the turbulence you didn't see that shook you the most. The aroma of reheated meals drifted through the cabin, signaling the start of dinner service. Jonah perked up in his seat, his earlier nerves from the turbulence forgotten. Is it time to eat, Mom? He asked, his eyes sparkling with anticipation. Clara smiled softly, her fingers brushing his cheek. Almost, sweetheart. Let's wait for the cart to come to us. She glanced down the aisle where two flight attendants worked methodically, handing out trays and responding to requests. The cabin buzzed with activity, the low hum of conversation mingling with the occasional clink of cutlery. The cart finally reached their row. Clara waited patiently as the flight attendants served the family in front of them, a father, mother, and their two young children. She noted the warm smile the attendant offered them, even crouching slightly to address the youngest child with a cheerful, "Here you go, sweetheart. Enjoy your meal." When the cart stopped at Clara's row, the tone shifted. The attendant's smile tightened, her voice brisk. "What do you want to drink?" she asked, her eyes skimming over Clara before landing on Jonah. Clara kept her voice calm. "We'll take 2 waters, please. And could I get a kid's meal for him?" The attendant nodded curtly, pouring the waters without a word. She handed them over before sliding a standard meal tray onto Clara's tray table. "Excuse me," Clara said, her tone even but firm. "I believe I requested a kid's meal for my son." The attendant straightened, a flicker of impatience crossing her face. "We're out of kids' meals," she said flatly. Clara blinked, glancing past her to the cart. Several brightly colored trays clearly marked for children were still stacked on the top shelf. Her gaze returned to the attendant, but she held her tongue. Jonah was watching, his small face creased with confusion. It's okay, Mom, he said softly. I can eat this one. Clara felt a familiar pang in her chest. But she nodded, brushing his hair back gently. You're so grown up, she said with a faint smile. Thank you, Jonah. The cart moved on, and Clara helped Jonah open the tray, arranging the silverware in his small hands. The portions were too large for him. The food unfamiliar. He poked at the entree with his fork, nibbling at the edges but leaving most of it untouched. Across the aisle, the White family with the baby was receiving their meals. Clara noted the flight attendant's easy laugh, the extra effort she made to ensure the family had everything they needed. A second kid's meal tray appeared from the cart, handed over without hesitation. Clara turned her attention back to Jonah, her movements slow and deliberate. She cut the entree into smaller pieces, coaxing him to take another bite. What do you think? She asked gently. It's okay, he replied, his tone uncertain. He reached for the bread roll instead, nibbling at the edges. Clara let him eat in peace. Her own appetite dulled. Around them, passengers were enjoying their meals, their conversations weaving a tapestry of normalcy that felt just out of reach. She sipped her water, her gaze fixed on the window beside Jonah's seat. The subtlety of it all weighed on her. No outright hostility, no raised voices or slammed trays. Just small omissions, quiet refusals, the kind of moments that could be brushed off if you didn't know to look for them. It was the kind of treatment that left no scars but lingered all the same. Like a shadow that stretched just a little too far. Jonah tugged at her sleeve, pulling her from her thoughts. Mom, can I have some juice? Clara nodded. Of course, sweetheart. She pressed the call button, waiting patiently for an attendant to respond. Minutes passed, and no one came. She glanced down the aisle, spotting a flight attendant chatting with a passenger near the front. Clara bit back a sigh, lowering her hand. It's okay, Jonah said again, his voice small but resolute. I don't really need it. Clara smiled, though the ache in her chest deepened. You're such a good boy, she said softly, pressing a kiss to his forehead. The dinner trays were eventually cleared away, and the lights in the cabin dimmed. Jonah leaned against her, his eyes growing heavy. Clara adjusted his blanket, stroking his hair as his breathing slowed. Outside the window, the sky was a deep, endless black, dotted with stars. Clara stared into it, her thoughts quiet but unyielding. The flight would end, the journey would continue, and the world would remain much the same. But for now, she held Jonah close, letting his warmth anchor her. Some battles were loud and fiery, others were fought in silence. One quiet indignity at a time. The cabin lights were dimmed now, casting a muted glow over the rows of passengers. Jonah had fallen asleep, his head resting against Clara's arm, his small hand curled loosely around her fingers. She felt his steady breathing against her side, a rhythmic comfort in the stillness of the night flight. Clara reached for the in-flight magazine, careful not to disturb him. As she flipped through its glossy pages, she became aware of movement in the aisle. A flight attendant was pushing a small cart filled with coffee and tea, stopping occasionally to offer passengers drinks. When the cart reached their row, Clara glanced up. Excuse me, she said softly. Could I have some hot water, please? The attendant looked at her, hesitating for a beat too long. We're out, she said shortly, moving past without further explanation. Clara blinked, momentarily stunned. She watched as the cart rolled toward the front of the cabin. Stopping at another row, a white passenger asked for tea, and the attendant handed over a steaming cup without hesitation. It wasn't about the tea. Clara knew that. It was about the ease with which she had been dismissed. As if her request didn't matter. As if she didn't matter. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft clatter. Jonah, stirring in his sleep, had accidentally knocked his plastic cup to the floor. It rolled into the aisle, coming to rest near the feet of a man across from them. The man, a wiry figure in his late 40s, looked down at the cup with a frown. He reached out, picked it up, and turned toward Clara. Your kid dropped this, he said, his tone edged with something Clara couldn't quite place. Thank you, she said, reaching for the cup. But he didn't hand it over. Instead, he held it up, his frown deepening. You should teach him to be more careful. Clara's stomach tightened. She opened her mouth to respond. But before she could, a woman a few rows back leaned into the aisle. Really? You're going to lecture her about a plastic cup? The woman said. Her voice low but firm. She was older, maybe in her 70s, with gray hair neatly pinned back. Her expression was calm, but there was a steeliness in her eyes. The man flushed, muttered something under his breath, and set the cup on Clara's tray table before turning back to his seat. The woman caught Clara's gaze and offered a faint smile. Some people just like to make things harder than they need to be, she said softly. Clara nodded, her gratitude unspoken but clear. She adjusted Jonah's blanket, her movements slow and deliberate, as if to shield him from the tension that had momentarily seeped into their space. As the flight settled back into quiet, Clara found herself thinking about the woman's words. She had always been careful, always quiet, always mindful of how her actions might be perceived. She had learned long ago that speaking up could come at a cost. But maybe, Clara thought, there was a different way to navigate these moments. A way to stand her ground without letting anger consume her. Later, when Jonah woke and asked for a drink, Clara pressed the call button again. This time, when the attendant came, she met the woman's gaze directly. My son would like some juice, Clara said, her tone polite but unwavering. The attendant hesitated for a split second before nodding. Of course, she said, disappearing into the galley and returning with a small cup of apple juice. Thank you, Clara said, taking the cup and handing it to Jonah. It was a small thing, almost imperceptible, but it felt like a victory. As Jonah sipped his juice, his eyes bright with contentment, Clara glanced toward the back of the plane where the older woman was sitting. Their eyes met briefly, and the woman gave her a subtle nod, as if to say, you did well. Clara leaned back in her seat, her hand resting lightly on Jonah's head. The flight still had hours to go, and the journey ahead was long. But for the first time that evening, the weight on her shoulders felt just a little lighter. The hum of the cabin had quieted further as passengers settled into the lull of the long flight. Jonah was awake now, flipping through the pages of his coloring book, his focus so intense that his tongue peeked out slightly from the corner of his mouth. Clara watched him for a moment, her heart lifting at his ability to find joy in even the smallest things. Across the aisle, the woman who had spoken up earlier sat with her reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose. Engrossed in a paperback novel, Clara wanted to thank her, but the timing never seemed quite right. Instead, she leaned back, letting her thoughts drift. Excuse me, a soft voice broke through the quiet. Clara turned to see a middle-aged black man in the row behind her leaning forward slightly. He wore a kind expression and nodded toward Jonah. You've got a great kid there, he said with a smile. Reminds me of my grandson. Same curiosity, same energy. Thank you, Clara replied, her voice warm. The man hesitated, then added, I couldn't help but notice earlier how that attendant treated you. His words were careful, his tone measured. It's not right. Happens far too often. Clara nodded slowly. It does, she said, but you get used to it, don't you? The man's smile faded, replaced by a look of quiet understanding. You shouldn't have to, he said. The conversation caught the attention of the older woman across the aisle. She set her book down and adjusted her glasses. It's not just about getting used to it, she said, her voice calm but firm. It's about making people see it, naming it for what it is. Clara glanced at her, surprised by the woman's directness. It feels like no one wants to hear it, Clara said after a moment. Or they don't believe it when you try to explain. Some don't, the woman agreed, but some do, and that matters. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes steady on Clara's. I was a schoolteacher for 40 years. Saw plenty of kids dismissed for things they couldn't control who they were. Where they came from. It stays with you, watching people ignore the unfairness because it's easier than confronting it. From behind Clara, the man nodded. She's right. It's easier to look away. But that doesn't mean you should. The quiet intensity of their words settled over Clara like a blanket. Warm and heavy, she thought of all the times she had let moments like this pass. Not out of fear, but out of exhaustion. Speaking up took energy she often didn't have to spare. Jonah tugged at her sleeve, drawing her attention. Mom, I'm done with this page. Can I do another one? Of course, Clara said, her voice soft. She turned back to the man behind her and the woman across the aisle, her expression thoughtful. Thank you, she said, the words carrying more weight than she expected. The older woman smiled. You've got a strong voice. Don't be afraid to use it. As the conversation waned, Clara noticed something shift around them. A young man in his 20s, sitting 2 rows ahead, turned slightly and offered her a nod. A couple across the aisle exchanged a glance, their expressions tinged with quiet recognition. It wasn't much, just fragments of acknowledgement, but it was enough to remind Clara that she wasn't alone. Later, as the flight attendants began clearing trays and preparing the cabin for landing, Clara found herself replaying the exchange in her mind. The man behind her, the woman across the aisle, they had given her something she hadn't realized she needed. A reminder that there was strength in sharing, in refusing to let small injustices go unnoticed. Jonah leaned against her, his head resting on her shoulder as the plane descended through the clouds. Clara stroked his hair absent-mindedly, her thoughts a quiet storm of reflection and resolve. Some voices carried louder than others, she thought, and maybe, just maybe, hers could be one of them. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the plane's descent. Jonas stirred in his seat, rubbing his eyes with small fists before sitting up to look out the window. The sun was rising, casting streaks of orange and pink across the horizon. Mom, we're almost there, he said, his voice bright with excitement. Clara smiled, adjusting his blanket and smoothing down his rumpled hair. We are, sweetheart, she replied, though her mind was still heavy with the conversations of the night. The cabin was coming back to life as passengers began packing away their belongings, the quiet hum of anticipation filling the air. Clara took a moment to breathe, looking out at the soft, glowing clouds outside. For all the tension and discomfort of the flight, there was something about this view that always felt grounding, a reminder of the vastness of the world. The possibility of perspective. As the plane began its gradual descent, a flight attendant walked down the aisle, checking seat belts and reminding passengers to stow their trays. Clara watched as the attendant stopped to smile warmly at a family 2 rows ahead, offering the child a set of wings with the airline's logo. When the attendant reached their row, the smile was gone. Her voice was brisk. Make sure your seatbelt is fastened, she said, without making eye contact. It is, Clara replied calmly, though her voice carried a quiet firmness. The attendant moved on without acknowledgement. Jonah looked up at Clara, sensing the tension. Why doesn't she like us? Mom? He asked quietly. Clara's heart ached at his question, but she kept her tone steady. It's not about liking or not liking, she said. Sometimes people act differently toward others for reasons that don't make sense. But it's not about us, it's about them. Jonah frowned, trying to process her words. Like when kids at school don't share their crayons. Clara smiled faintly, brushing his cheek with her hand. Something like that, she said. As the plane descended further, the city below came into view, a patchwork of roads, rooftops, and parks glinting in the morning sun. Clara felt Jonah lean into her side, his small hand slipping into hers. Are we going to tell Grandma about the plane ride? He asked. We'll tell her about the good parts, Clara replied, her voice soft. And the bad parts? Clara hesitated, then nodded. Maybe those too. Sometimes it's important to talk about the things that weren't fair, so people understand. Jonah seemed satisfied with her answer, his attention shifting back to the view outside. Clara felt a swell of pride for him, for his curiosity, his resilience, and his ability to ask questions that even adults struggled to answer. As the wheels touched down and the plane slowed to a crawl, the passengers around them began clapping softly. Jonah joined in, grinning widely. We did it, he said, his voice filled with triumph. Clara chuckled. We did, didn't we? The plane taxied to the gate, and the familiar shuffle of passengers gathering their belongings began. Clara helped Jonah put on his small backpack, her movements slow and deliberate. She wasn't in a rush to leave, though part of her longed for the comfort of solid ground. As they stepped into the aisle, Clara felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to see the older woman who had spoken up earlier. Her warm smile steady. You handled yourself well, the woman said quietly. It's not easy, but it matters. Thank you, Clara replied, her voice tinged with gratitude. The woman gave her a nod before disappearing into the flow of passengers. Clara held Jonah's hand tightly as they made their way off the plane. The early morning air hitting them as they stepped into the terminal. The journey wasn't over, not for Clara. Not for Jonah. Not for anyone who carried the quiet weight of being seen differently. But as they walked toward the baggage claim, Clara felt a renewed sense of purpose. Some battles were won through words, others through actions, and still others simply by enduring. And today, that endurance felt like a victory in itself. The airport terminal was alive with movement and sound, travelers reuniting with loved ones. Luggage wheels clattering across tiled floors. Announcements echoing from overhead speakers. Clara held Jonah's hand as they navigated the crowd, her other hand gripping the handle of their suitcase. Jonah skipped slightly beside her, his energy renewed after the long flight. Do you think Grandma will have pancakes for breakfast? He asked, his eyes alight with hope. Clara smiled softly. If I know Grandma, she probably has a whole feast waiting for us. Jonah grinned, his excitement momentarily erasing the weight of the past few hours. For him, the world was still simple, filled with family, comfort, and the certainty of love. Clara envied that clarity, even as she felt a responsibility to protect it for as long as she could. As they reached the baggage claim, Clara's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out to see a notification from a social media platform, a reminder of the post she had started drafting during the flight but hadn't yet published. The post was simple, just a few sentences about their experience, the dismissive glances, the uneven service, the small but undeniable moments that had marked the journey. Clara had hesitated to share it, unsure if her words would resonate or if they would simply be dismissed as overreaction. Now, standing amidst the chaos of the terminal, she glanced at Jonah, who was peering into the carousel, searching for their suitcase. His curiosity was unclouded, his enthusiasm unshaken. It was for him that she decided to hit post. The reaction was immediate. As they waited for their luggage, Clara's phone buzzed again and again, comments of support. Messages from friends and strangers alike sharing their own experiences. Some thanked her for speaking up. Others expressed outrage at what she had endured. Clara read a few, her chest tightening with a mix of emotions. The support was heartening, but the sheer number of similar stories was sobering. How many others had walked through the world carrying this quiet burden? Their voices unheard? By the time they retrieved their suitcase and made their way to the arrivals area, Clara's phone had rung twice. One call was from her sister, who had seen the post and wanted to check on her. The other was from a number she didn't recognize. She hesitated before answering. Hello? Ms. Thompson? A professional voice on the other end asked. Yes. This is she. This is Sarah Daniels from the Customer Relations Department at the airline. We saw your post and wanted to reach out personally. On behalf of the airline, I'd like to apologize for your experience and assure you that we're taking it seriously. Clara's grip on the phone tightened. She glanced at Jonah, who was now waving excitedly at his grandmother waiting by the exit. Thank you for calling, Clara said, her tone measured. I hope you'll take this as an opportunity to improve how your staff treats all passengers. We will, the woman promised. We'd like to invite you to speak with our team about your experience. If you're open to it, your feedback could help us create better training for our staff. Clara paused, considering. She didn't trust promises easily, but the idea of turning this moment into something constructive appealed to her. I'll think about it, she said finally. As she ended the call, Jonah tugged at her arm, pulling her toward his grandmother. The older woman enveloped them both in a warm hug, her joy at their arrival washing over them like sunlight. Come on, Grandma said, taking Jonah's hand. I've got pancakes waiting at home. As they walked toward the exit, Clara felt a quiet resolve settling within her. The flight was behind her, but the work was not. She wasn't naive enough to think that one post or one conversation would change everything. But it was a start, a small step towards something bigger. The journey had been long, and the road ahead would be longer still. But for the first time, Clara felt ready to walk it. Her voice steady, her purpose clear, and as they stepped into the cool morning air, Jonah's laughter ringing out beside her, Clara couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. The world might not change overnight, but one voice at a time, it could begin to shift.